The sound of Catherine's laughter cut through the hum of conversation like a blade. "To Peter," she announced, raising her glass high, the crystal catching the dim light of the chandelier. Her voice was too loud, too sharp, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. "The most clueless man I know. Cheers to 50 years of blissful ignorance." The room erupted in forced laughter. Her fitness friends, all toned arms and tight smiles, clinking their glasses together. I stood there, holding my own drink, feeling the weight of their stares. My 50th birthday party. My house. My wife. And yet, I felt like an outsider in my own life. The dining table was a mess of half-eaten appetizers and abandoned plates. In the center, the rose arrangement I'd made earlier that morning was already wilting, petals curling at the edges like they were trying to escape. I'd spent hours picking the perfect blooms from the greenhouse. Deep reds and soft pinks, her favorite colors. Now they looked as tired as I felt. Catherine was holding court near the fireplace, her voice carrying over the low murmur of conversation. She was wearing that black dress, the one she knew I loved, but tonight it felt like a costume. Her friends leaned in, hanging on her every word, their laughter punctuating the air like gunshots. One of them, Tammy, I think, kept glancing my way, her expression unreadable. I drifted toward the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. The framed family photo on the wall caught my eye as I passed. It was tilted slightly, the glass reflecting the flicker of candlelight. Emily, our daughter, beamed from the center, her high school graduation cap perched awkwardly on her head. Catherine and I stood on either side, smiling like we meant it. That was 5 years ago. I reached out to straighten the frame but stopped myself. Let it stay crooked. The kitchen was cooler, quieter. I set my glass on the counter and leaned against the sink, staring out the window into the backyard. The greenhouse stood at the far end, its glass panes glowing faintly in the moonlight. My sanctuary. The roses didn't laugh at me. They didn't toast my cluelessness. A burst of laughter from the living room pulled me back. I turned to see Catherine standing in the doorway, her glass still in hand. "Hiding, Peter?" she teased, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's your party, darling. You should be enjoying yourself." She stepped closer, the scent of her perfume, something floral and expensive, filling the space between us. For a moment, I thought she might kiss me, but she just brushed past, reaching for the wine bottle on the counter. Her fingers lingered on the label, tracing the edge like she was memorizing it. "You should join us," she said, not looking at me. "You're the guest of honor, after all." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She swept back into the living room, her laughter ringing out again, sharp and bright. I picked up my glass and followed, the weight of her words settling in my chest like a stone. Something was off. I could feel it in the air, in the way her friends avoided my eyes, in the way Catherine's smile didn't quite reach her voice. But I pushed the thought aside, blaming it on the wine, on the stress of hosting, on the fact that 50 felt heavier than I'd expected. It was just a party, just a moment, just the way she said my name like it was a punchline. And yet, as I stepped back into the room, the wilting roses caught my eye again. Their petals were falling now, scattering across the table like confetti. I reached out to touch one, its velvet softness already turning brittle. I should have known then, but I didn't. Not yet. The party was still in full swing, the kind of forced merriment that makes your jaw ache from fake smiling. I was refilling the punch bowl, the kind of mundane task that lets you disappear in plain sight, when Emily grabbed my arm. Her grip was too tight, her face too pale under the string lights we'd hung across the patio. "Dad," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to talk. Now." I followed her to the edge of the yard, where the shadows from the oak tree swallowed us whole. The cicadas were screaming in the distance, their relentless hum like a warning. Emily's hands were shaking, and she kept glancing over her shoulder toward the house, where Catherine was holding court with her gym friends, her laughter sharp enough to cut glass. "What's wrong, kiddo?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But the way she looked at me, like I was a bomb about to go off, made my stomach drop. "I overheard Mom," she said, her words coming out in a rush. She was talking to her friends in the kitchen. "Dad, she's been seeing someone. Some guy who's supposed to fund her fitness club. They were laughing about it like it was some big joke. Like you were a joke." The ground beneath me didn't just shift, it cracked open. I stared at Emily, her face blurring as my vision tunneled. The punch bowl in my hands felt impossibly heavy, like it was filled with lead instead of fruit juice. I set it down on the cracked patio tile, the red liquid sloshing over the edges, staining the concrete like blood. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Emily wasn't the kind of kid to make something like this up. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears she was too proud to let fall. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't let you keep living in the dark." I reached out to hug her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "If Mom sees us talking like this, she'll know I told you. I can't deal with her right now." I watched her walk back toward the house, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying the weight of the world. The cicadas kept screaming, their noise drowning out the party chatter, the clinking glasses, the hollow laughter. I stood there, staring at the cracked tile under my feet, the one I'd been meaning to fix for months. Now it felt like a metaphor for everything I'd ignored, everything I'd let slide. Catherine's voice cut through the noise, sharp and mocking. "Peter, where's that punch? We're dying of thirst over here." I picked up the bowl, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. The red liquid sloshed again, spilling onto my shoes. I didn't care. Let it stain. Let it ruin everything. The truth was out there now, hanging in the air like the scent of rotting fruit. And I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unhear it. The ground had shifted, and I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss. The kitchen felt like a battlefield, the air heavy with the scent of spilled wine and something faintly metallic. The knife block on the counter stood like a silent sentinel, its presence oddly menacing. Catherine stood by the sink, her back to me, her shoulders stiff. She was rinsing a glass, the water running too loudly, as if she could drown out the tension with its noise. I cleared my throat, and she turned, her face a mask of calm, but her eyes, those damn eyes, gave her away. They flickered for just a second, like a candle caught in a draft. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. The words hung between us, sharp and unyielding. She set the glass down carefully, her movements deliberate, and folded her arms across her chest. "About what?" she asked, her tone light, almost mocking. But I saw the way her fingers dug into her arms, the way her jaw tightened just slightly. "About you. About us." I stepped closer, and she didn't back away, but her smirk faltered. "I know, Catherine. I know everything." For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed, a short, bitter sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Peter," she said, shaking her head. "What exactly do you think you know?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled receipt Emily had found. A reservation for a hotel room downtown, paid for with our joint account. I tossed it onto the counter, and it slid to a stop in front of her. She glanced at it, her smirk fading, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she leaned back against the counter, her arms still crossed, and tilted her head as if I were a child who just said something amusing. "Is that it?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "A hotel receipt? Really, Peter, you're smarter than this. Or at least I thought you were." "Don't," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. "Don't play games with me. Not now." Her expression hardened, and she pushed off the counter, stepping closer until we were face to face. "Fine," she said, her voice low and icy. "You want the truth? Here it is. Yes, I've been seeing someone. Someone who actually pays attention to me, who doesn't spend every waking moment buried in dirt and roses. Someone who sees me." Her words landed like punches, each one hitting harder than the last. I felt the ground shift beneath me, but I didn't let it show. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice flat, almost detached. She hesitated, then shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "His name's Daniel. He's an investor. He's funding my fitness club. And before you ask, yes, it's been going on for months. And yes, it's been intimate." She said the last word with a cruel emphasis, her eyes boring into mine, daring me to react. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I looked past her, at the wilting bouquet on the windowsill, a gift from her friends, now brown and brittle at the edges. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why him? Why now? She let out a short, humorless laugh. Why not him? Why not now? You've been so wrapped up in your little world, Peter, tending to your precious roses, that you didn't even notice I was gone. You didn't notice me slipping away, didn't notice the nights I spent out, the excuses I made. You didn't care. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the words caught in my throat, because maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe I had been too focused on the roses, on the quiet solace they offered, to see what was happening right in front of me. But that didn't excuse this. Nothing could. So that's it. I asked, my voice hollow. You just moved on? Without even telling me? She shrugged again, her expression cold and unapologetic. What was I supposed to do, Peter? Wait for you to notice me? To care? You made your choice a long time ago. I just made mine. I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I'd married, the one I'd built a life with. But she was unrecognizable now, her face a mask of indifference, her eyes empty. And in that moment, I realized something. She wasn't sorry. Not for the affair, not for the lies, not for any of it. She was only sorry she'd been caught. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until she finally broke it. Is that all? She asked, her tone dismissive. Because if you're done playing detective, I have things to do. I didn't respond. Couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, her cold words still ringing in my ears. The house felt too big, too empty. As I made my way to the greenhouse, the only place where the world still made sense. The roses would be there, waiting for me, their blooms untouched by the chaos of my life. And for the first time, I wondered if that was enough. The greenhouse was always my sanctuary. Even as a kid, I'd hide in my grandfather's, the smell of damp earth and the faint hum of a space heater lulling me into something like peace. I built this one myself, every pane of glass, every bolt in the aluminum frame. Catherine called it my obsession, but she didn't understand. It wasn't just about the roses. It was about creating something that couldn't lie to me, couldn't betray me. At 3 a.m., the world outside was silent, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of blooms and the faint tang of fertilizer. Moonlight spilled through the glass, casting jagged shadows across the rows of roses. My prize-winning hybrids, velvet petals in shades of crimson and gold, their names etched on little brass plaques. I'd spent years perfecting them, grafting, pruning, coaxing them into something extraordinary. They were the one thing I'd done right. I sat on the wooden bench, my hands crusted with dirt, and stared at the trowel I'd left in the soil earlier. It stuck out at an angle like a grave marker. I didn't cry. I wasn't sure I could anymore. Instead, I felt this hollow ache spreading through my chest, like someone had carved out everything soft inside me and left behind this cold, empty shell. Catherine's words kept replaying in my head. You're always in here, Peter. Always with your roses. What about me? What about us? At the time, I thought she was just frustrated, maybe lonely. I tried to make it up to her. Dinners out, weekends away, even that stupid salsa dancing class she begged me to take. But now, sitting here in the dark, I saw it for what it was. A distraction. She'd been gaslighting me for years, turning my passion into a flaw, my dedication into neglect. All while she was plotting, scheming, laughing with her friends about how clueless I was. I reached out and touched the petals of a single blooming rose. It was perfect, unblemished, its edges catching the moonlight like silk. I'd named it Eternal Promise after Catherine and I renewed our vows on our 20th anniversary. Back then, I thought we were invincible. I thought we'd built something that couldn't be broken. But now, looking at that rose, all I could see was the rot beneath the surface. The way she'd used me, drained our accounts, turned my trust into a weapon. The anger came in waves, hot and sudden, before ebbing back into that numb, aching void. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to tear the whole greenhouse down. But I didn't. I just sat there, my fingers trembling as I traced the curve of the rose's petals. It wasn't just the affair. It was the way she'd twisted everything, made me feel like I was the one who'd failed, like I was the one who'd let us down. And maybe I had, in some ways, Maybe I'd been too blind, too trusting, too willing to believe in the lie of us. But that didn't make what she'd done okay. It didn't make it right. I picked up the trowel and pressed the blade into the soil, turning it over and over until the earth was loose and dark. The roses didn't judge me. They didn't lie. They just grew, reaching for the light, their roots digging deeper into the soil. Maybe that's why I loved them so much. They didn't need words or promises. They just needed care, attention, a steady hand. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't hope exactly, more like resolve. A quiet, simmering determination to take back what was mine. Not just my money, my dignity, but my life. Catherine thought she'd won. She thought she'd broken me. But she didn't know me, not really. She didn't know what I was capable of. I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, and left the greenhouse. The night air was cool against my skin, and the stars were sharp and bright overhead. Somewhere out there, Catherine was sleeping, dreaming of her new life, her fresh start. But she'd made a mistake. She'd underestimated me, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, slicing the room into sharp lines of gold and shadow. Peter sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee he hadn't touched. The house felt hollow, like the air had been sucked out of it, leaving only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards upstairs. He stared at the stack of unpaid bills on the table, their edges curled like dead leaves. He hadn't noticed them before, or maybe he had, but he'd ignored them, trusting Catherine to handle the finances. Trust. The word tasted bitter now. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, deliberate and unhurried. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her designer suitcase rolling behind her. It was half-packed, the lid gaping open to reveal a jumble of clothes, jewelry, and a few framed photos she'd snatched from the walls. She didn't look at him as she crossed to the fridge, pulling out a bottle of cold-pressed juice. Her movements were efficient, almost robotic, as if she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. Peter watched her, his chest tight. "You're really doing this?" he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. Catherine paused, her back to him, and took a slow sip of juice. "You'll never understand what it takes to succeed," she said finally, her tone icy, almost clinical. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You've been content to play in the dirt while I've been building something real. Something that matters." He wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. "Building something? By draining our accounts? By lying to me for months?" She shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture that made his stomach twist. "I did what I had to do. You were never going to support me, Peter. You were too busy with your roses, with your little projects. You didn't see me. You didn't see what I needed." Her words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Peter's hands tightened around the mug. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused him. But instead, he stayed seated, his mind racing. This wasn't the Catherine he'd married. This wasn't the woman who'd once laughed with him over cheap wine in their first apartment, who'd held his hand at Emily's birth, who'd stood by him when his father died. This was someone else, someone colder, harder, utterly unrecognizable. Catherine zipped her suitcase shut with a final, decisive sound. She glanced around the kitchen, her gaze lingering on the wilting fern in the corner. "I'll send for the rest of my things later," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You can keep the house. It's not like you'd know what to do without it." She wheeled the suitcase toward the door, her heels clicking against the tile. Peter stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You think you're the only one who's been working, Catherine? That your dreams are the only ones that matter?" His voice was low, edged with a quiet fury that surprised even him. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or hesitation. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Goodbye, Peter," she said, and then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Peter sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. He stared at the stack of bills, at the wilting fern, at the empty space where Catherine had stood. His mind began to piece together the fragments of what she'd done. The withdrawals he hadn't noticed, the excuses she'd made, the late nights at the gym that weren't about fitness at all. It was all there if he'd only been willing to see it. He reached for the mug of cold coffee and took a sip, the bitterness grounding him. This wasn't the end, he realized. It was the beginning. Catherine had taken everything she thought she could, but she'd underestimated him. She'd underestimated the man who could coax life from barren soil, who could turn a single seed into a garden. Peter set the mug down and stood, his resolve hardening. He had work to do. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes in the air like tiny, suspended secrets. I sat at the table, staring at the bank statement in front of me, the numbers circled in red ink like wounds. The joint account, our shared lifeblood for over 2 decades, was nearly empty. $47.32. That's what was left after Catherine had systematically siphoned off thousands over the past 6 months. I ran a hand through my hair, the familiar scent of soil still lingering under my nails from the greenhouse. The calculator sat beside me, its screen glowing with a series of calculations I'd made over the past hour. Mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries. The math didn't lie. She'd left me with just enough to keep the house afloat, but not a penny more. The wilting potted plant by the window seemed to mock me, its leaves drooping like a silent accusation. I'd watered it faithfully, just as I'd watered our marriage. But some things, no matter how much care you give them, are destined to wither. I flipped through the statement again, my eyes catching on the recurring withdrawals. $5,000 here, $3,000 there. Always just under the threshold that would have triggered a bank alert. Clever. Calculated. Catherine had always been meticulous, but this was a level of precision that felt almost surgical. I leaned back in the chair, my mind racing. The money had gone somewhere, and I had a pretty good idea where. Her fitness club dreams had always been a topic of conversation, but I chalked it up to midlife ambition. Now, it was clear she'd been funding more than just dumbbells and yoga mats. There were hotel charges, luxury boutiques, even a $1,200 charge at a high-end jewelry store. The receipts painted a picture of a life I hadn't been part of. One she'd been living while I was pruning roses and watering ferns. My jaw clenched as I thought about her lover, the investor with his slick suits and promises of funding. How long had they been laughing behind my back? How many times had she come home from their secret trysts, her skin still humming with the thrill of betrayal, only to kiss me on the cheek like nothing was wrong? But the anger didn't last. Couldn't. There was too much to do, too many pieces to pick up. I grabbed the calculator again, punching in numbers with a steady hand. The greenhouse was still mine, and so were the roses. Catherine had never cared much for them, dismissing them as just flowers. But they were more than that. They were my craft, my legacy, and they were worth something. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name of a collector I'd met at a gardening convention years ago. He'd offered to buy my rare roses before, but I'd always refused. Not anymore. As I dialed his number, my eyes drifted back to the wilting plant by the window. For the first time, I noticed a single green shoot pushing through the soil, a tiny, defiant sign of life. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth nurturing. But first I had a call to make, and a plan to set in motion. The greenhouse smelled like damp earth and the faint tang of fertilizer, the kind of smell that usually grounded me. But that day, it just felt heavy, like the air before a storm. I stood there, staring at the row of black baccarat roses I'd been cultivating for years. Their velvety, almost black petals were my pride, the kind of roses that made people stop and stare. And now they were the only thing of value I had left. The collector arrived at noon, a wiry man in his 60s with hands calloused from decades of gardening. He didn't say much, just nodded as I showed him the roses, his eyes lighting up like a kid in a candy store. I could tell he knew their worth. When he handed me the check, his grip was firm, his voice low. "You sure about this?" he asked. I didn't answer. I just stared at the numbers on the check, the ink still wet, and thought about how much of my life I'd poured into those roses. And now I was trading them for answers. The private investigator's office was in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place you'd walk past without a second glance. His name was Frank, and he had the look of a man who'd seen too much but didn't mind seeing more. I slid the check across his desk, along with Catherine's name and a few details I'd pieced together. He didn't ask why I was doing this. Maybe he could see it in my face, the weariness, the anger simmering just below the surface. "Give me a week," he said, pocketing the check. "I'll find what you're looking for." That week felt like a lifetime. I tried to keep busy, pruning the remaining roses, repotting seedlings, anything to keep my hands moving. But my mind kept circling back to Catherine. Her laughter at the party, the way she toasted my cluelessness. I'd always thought her ambition was admirable, even when it took her away from home for days at a time. Now, I couldn't stop wondering how long she'd been playing me for a fool. Frank called me in exactly 7 days. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach twist. "You'll want to see this," he said. The photos were spread across his desk like a deck of cards, each one more damning than the last. Catherine and the investor, a man with a slick smile and a Rolex that probably cost more than my truck, meeting in hotel lobbies, sharing meals, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. There were receipts, 2 luxury hotels, expensive dinners, withdrawals from our joint account. And then there were the emails, printed out in stark black and white. Plans to leave me, to take everything she could, to start her new life with him. I felt numb at first, like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me. But then the anger came, hot and sharp, like a thorn digging into my palm. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd planned it, down to the last detail. She'd been calculating, cold, and I'd been too blind to see it. Frank handed me a business card, his expression unreadable. "You've got what you need," he said. "What you do with it is up to you." I left his office with the folder tucked under my arm, the weight of it pressing against my chest. Back at the greenhouse, I sat at the workbench, the scent of roses filling the air. A single petal had fallen onto the table, deep red and velvety, like a drop of blood. I picked it up, turning it over in my fingers, and thought about how something so beautiful could still carry thorns. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, staring at the petal, and started planning my next move. Catherine thought she'd outsmarted me, that I was too wrapped up in my roses to see what was happening. But she'd underestimated me, and now she was going to find out just how sharp those thorns could be. The investigator's office smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper, the kind of place where secrets came to die. He slid the manila folder across the desk toward me, his face unreadable behind the glare of his wire-rimmed glasses. "Everything you need is in there," he said, his voice low and steady, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Maybe he had. I opened the folder, and there she was, Catherine, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, her arm looped around him. The investor, some slick-haired suit with a Rolex that probably cost more than my truck. There were photos of them at restaurants, at hotels, at what looked like some swanky rooftop bar. And then there were the documents, bank statements, wire transfers, receipts for things I didn't even know she'd bought. A necklace, a weekend at some luxury resort, payments to her so-called business partners, who, as it turned out, were just fronts for funneling money into her fitness club dream. I stared at the wilting rose on the investigator's desk, its petals curling inward like it was trying to hide from the truth. That's what I wanted to do, hide. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The anger bubbled up, hot and sharp, but I kept it in check. This wasn't the time for rage. This was the time to be smart, to be strategic. "What now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. The investigator leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Now, you decide how to play this. You've got the proof. You can go nuclear or you can be surgical." He paused, studying me. "Personally, I'd recommend the latter. Hit her where it hurts most, her reputation. But that's your call." I nodded, already knowing what I had to do. Catherine's fitness club launch was in a week. She'd been bragging about it for months, posting about it on every social media platform she could find. It was supposed to be her big moment, her chance to shine. And I was going to be there, front and center, to make sure it was her last. I left the office with the folder tucked under my arm, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my truck for a while, staring at the dashboard, the folder on the passenger seat like a ticking bomb. Part of me wanted to tear it open again, to pore over every photo, every document, until the betrayal burned itself into my brain. But I didn't. I'd seen enough. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound. When I got back, I went straight to the greenhouse. The roses were blooming, their petals soft and perfect, like they didn't have a care in the world. I sat on the old wooden stool in the corner, the folder in my lap, and stared at them. They didn't judge. They didn't lie. They just grew steady and true no matter what. I opened the folder one last time, flipping to a photo of Catherine and the investor. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hair catching the light. I'd seen that laugh before, but never like this. Never directed at me. I closed the folder and set it aside. The plan was simple. Wait for the launch. Let her think she's won. And then, when the moment was right, I'd show everyone who she really was. Not the perfect wife. Not the ambitious entrepreneur. Just a liar. A cheat. A thief. I picked up my trowel and got back to work, the smell of damp earth filling my lungs. The roses didn't need me to explain. They just needed me to keep going. And that's what I'd do. One step at a time. The air in the room was thick with the scent of overpriced perfume and the faint tang of desperation. The fitness club launch was in full swing, a glittering spectacle of neon lights, loud music, and champagne flutes clinking like hollow promises. Catherine stood at the center of it all, radiant in a sleek black dress, her smile as polished as the investor's Rolex. She was in her element, holding court with her fitness friends and the handful of wealthy backers who had bought into her vision. From the back of the room, I watched her, a wilting flower arrangement on the stage mirroring the fragility of the moment. I hadn't planned to be here, not really, but something about the manila folder in my hand, its weight, its truth, had pulled me in. The investigator's photos were crisp, the documents damning. Catherine and the investor, caught in moments of intimacy that left no room for doubt. Bank statements showing transfers to offshore accounts. Emails detailing her plans to leave me bankrupt while she rode off into the sunset with her new life. It was all there, neatly packaged in that folder, waiting to unravel the tapestry of lies she'd woven. I didn't storm in. I didn't make a scene. I just waited, letting the champagne flow and the laughter rise, until the moment felt right. When the investor stepped up to the mic to give his speech, praising Catherine's vision and drive, I moved forward, my steps measured, my heart steady. The crowd parted slightly as I approached, a ripple of confusion spreading through the room. Catherine's eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second her smile faltered. That was all I needed. I handed the folder to the investor, my voice low but clear. Before you commit to anything, you might want to see this. He hesitated, then opened it, his face shifting from curiosity to disbelief as he flipped through the contents. Catherine's friends, sensing trouble, started to murmur. The room grew quieter, the music fading into the background like a dying echo. "What is this?" the investor demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Catherine stepped forward, her composure cracking. "Peter, what are you doing? This is ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's the truth, and you know it." The investor turned to her, his face a mask of betrayal. "You said this was a clean investment. You said there were no complications." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The room was silent now, every eye on her. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in her discomfort. I just stood there, watching as the walls she'd built around her lies crumbled. The investor tossed the folder onto a nearby table, the photos spilling out for everyone to see. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand, shattering on the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Catherine's friends backed away, their loyalty evaporating in an instant. The investor stormed out, his parting words, "We're done here," hanging in the air like a death knell. Catherine turned to me, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and panic. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. "No," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." The room erupted into chaos, people whispering, pointing, some even leaving. Catherine stood there, her perfect evening unraveling around her, the wilting flowers on the stage a fitting backdrop to her downfall. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I'd seen enough. As I walked out, the faint hum of cicadas outside reminded me of the night Emily had first told me the truth. Felt like a lifetime ago. The cool night air hit me like a bomb, and I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few months lift just a little. Justice, not revenge. That's what this was. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The greenhouse smells of damp earth and new growth, the kind of scent that clings to your skin and lingers in your lungs long after you've left. I sit on the old wooden stool I've had for years, its legs wobbling slightly under my weight, and run my fingers along the edge of a freshly sharpened trowel. The blade catches the late afternoon light, glinting like a promise. Outside, the world feels heavy with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. Quiet, but not entirely at peace. The roses are thriving now. I've replaced the ones I sold, each new bush a kind of defiance against everything Catherine took. The blooms are deep red, almost black in the fading light, their petals unfurling like fists slowly opening. I don't know why I chose this color. Maybe because they remind me of something raw and unpolished, something alive in a way I wasn't for a long time. On the workbench, propped against a clay pot, is a new family photo. It's just Emily and me taken a few weeks ago at her graduation. She's smiling in that way she does when she's trying not to cry, her arms slung around my shoulders like she's the one holding me up. I keep it here in this space that's always been mine because it feels like a kind of reclamation, a reminder that not everything she touched turned to ash. Catherine's fitness club collapsed within months of the launch. The investor pulled out after I handed him the folder of evidence, and her so-called friends scattered like cockroaches when the lights came on. She tried to spin it as a rebranding opportunity on social media, but the comments section tore her apart. I didn't watch it happen, not really. By then, I'd already moved on to the kind of quiet revenge that doesn't require applause, paying off the last of the debts she left me with, rebuilding what she tried to destroy. Sometimes, when the greenhouse is too quiet, I still hear her voice. Not the sharp, mocking tone she used at the end, but the softer one from years ago, when we were still pretending to be happy. It's not nostalgia. It's more like the echo of a door slamming shut, the kind of sound that makes you jump even when you know it's coming. I don't hate her anymore. Hate feels too much like giving her space in my head, and I've spent enough years doing that. But I won't forget either. The scars are still there, faint but present, like the faint lines on my hands from years of pruning roses. They remind me of what I survived, what I rebuilt. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows across the greenhouse floor. I pick up the trowel and dig into the soil at the base of one of the new rose bushes, feeling the resistance give way to something softer, richer. It's strange how destruction can sometimes make room for something better. The roses seem to understand that, their roots reaching deeper, their blooms growing bolder with each passing day. I lean back on the stool, wiping my hands on my jeans, and take it all in. The smell of earth, the hum of the heater kicking on, the faint buzz of bees outside the glass. It's not the life I planned for, but it's mine. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. The trowel sits on the bench, its blade catching the last of the sunlight. I leave it there, knowing I'll need it again tomorrow. For now, I just sit and watch as the shadows grow longer, the roses swaying gently in the breeze, their petals dark and unyielding against the fading light.